Richard Roth is in Islamabad, Pakistan, keeping in mind that that's the capital of Pakistan now. And we bring up Richard Roth. Richard?
Dan, what we've heard here so far is something I guess that might have been expected, and that is some angry rhetoric from some of the groups that have been opposed to the cooperation of the Pakistani government here and opposed rather strongly to any American attack in Afghanistan. One pro-Taliban Islamic group said tonight that it called the attacks in Afghanistan a brutal attack on innocent people. It said that America's used its might against innocent people instead of against terrorist training camps. Now, the rhetoric here was fully expected. What the government is concerned about, of course, is that it's going to incite people in the kinds of demonstrations that have been taking place for several weeks on the streets here. And the government here in Islamabad did something about that today. They detained one of the leading Islamic clerics who's been calling for a holy war if America did stage a military strike in Afghanistan. The government says that it can control the demonstrations, and it does believe that they are a small minority of Pakistan's population. But clearly, officials here have said that they want any action in Afghanistan to be what one official called decisive and quick. They're concerned that the longer it goes on, the more the dissent here will grow. Dan?
Richard Roth. Richard, keeping in mind Islamabad is in the northern part of Afghanistan, when I said in the introduction, you said it is now the capital of Pakistan. It has been the capital of Pakistan for a long while up in the northern part of the country. Years ago, Karachi down south was considered to be the capital of the country. It's worth pointing out that the northern part of Pakistan, where you are now, Peshawar, Islamabad, represents the tribal entity that is most inclined to side with the Taliban, correct?
Well, that's the Pashtun tribe, but I must say, Dan, that there are certain elements of that tribe, and I was talking with one of the major commanders who was fought during the time of the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan yesterday. I met with him in Peshawar, who claims that he has wide support among Pashtuns and also among, he said, Talibans who are defecting, members of the Taliban who are defecting from their ranks. So I think that there's certainly been an effort on the part of some of those commanders who have come back, who have intended to fight against the Taliban, to enlist the support of the majority Pashtun that also are part of the Taliban. And I don't think that we can say that the Taliban, that the Pashtun support is only for the Taliban.
Understand. My only point was it's the northern and bordering Afghanistan sections of Pakistan where the most anti-American demonstrations have been held, and where the most of the what there is of it in Pakistan, keeping in mind that it's very dangerous to generalize, because Pakistan has its own complicated tribal situation. It's just not to jump to the conclusion that everybody in Pakistan, or a majority in Pakistan, are against the United States. It's just impossible to tell, although you might sometimes get that impression just looking at television coverage in places like Islamabad and Peshawar. We go to Mitch Mitchell, our retired U.S. Army, who is with us as our consultant. Colonel Mitchell, give us some perspective and context on these strikes that are continuing at this hour.
Well, Dan, we're pretty sure that we're going after the same types of targets we went after when we were in the Gulf War. We're knocking out the eyes and ears of our enemy, allowing him to go around blindly seeking us and wondering where we're going to hit next. That's an important part of preparation of the battlefield. I think the other thing that's important is the President in his speech said that our objectives are clear. That is the most important thing for a military operation of any type and any scope, to have clear objectives, to know exactly what you're trying to accomplish, and then following that, what constitutes success. So we're off to a good start. If he says our objectives are clear, I believe him. I'm sure our commanders in the field feel the same way.
Mitchell, the President mentioned that while today it's Afghanistan, he made a point of saying that there's a broader outline of possible such actions in the future. Now, I listed before, I think I left out Sudan, come to mind Iraq, Iran, Sudan, Libya, and the Bekaa Valley. Have I left out any on the top list of places that are now or are known to have in the fairly recent past harbored, aided, and abetted terrorists?
I think we should look at another direction also, Dan, with North Korea. They have been known to sponsor terrorism. They haven't changed their policies. They've said a lot about it, but they haven't shown anyone that they are going to change their policies of supporting terrorism. I think another thing that the President said that's very important that follows on what you just asked is that, to paraphrase it, we will pursue those who contemplate terrorism. That's very important to us because it changes the nature of the way we look at terrorism. Right now we're in a counterterrorism operation, but what we're going to do in the future, according to the President, is go into an anti-terrorism configuration, one in which we stop those who contemplate terrorist acts before they ever get off the ground. A very important policy statement from the President, Dan.
Mitch Mitchell in Washington, who's helping us today with our analysis in an effort to give you some perspective on what's happening. Dateline, Karachi, Pakistan, that's the largest city in the country. A Taliban diplomat says, quote, "We are ready for jihad," unquote. And to that, no American diplomat has said as much, but obviously the answer is, well, you'd better be ready because right now American bombers and cruise missiles are hitting in Afghanistan. That's to be followed by airdrops of food to the Afghanistan people once daylight comes there. Now, we're standing by to take you to Great Britain, where the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Tony Blair, who has had war aircraft involved in today's strike, is about to speak to the British people. We'll bring that to you live once Tony Blair comes. Now, the damage outside Kabul itself, in and around Kabul, but outside Kabul itself primarily, we're told. In fact, there are no reports of heavy damage in the Afghan capital. That's been hit hard. The air facilities around Jalalabad in the southeastern part of the country near the border with Pakistan are reported to have been hit hard. And then Kandahar, where there are air facilities and other weapons owned by the Taliban, and indeed many of the Taliban leaders have been headquartered in Kandahar, strikes outside Kandahar. We have not heard official confirmation of hits in Herat, airstrip there. David Martin mentioned earlier, no one knows whether they'd moved their aircraft off of Herat in the northwest corner up there. These other places she listed are places where they're known to have had some weaponry, the Taliban. Now, when you look at Jalalabad, down sort of the right off center of your picture, some weeks ago, supposedly, allegedly, and reportedly, according to the Taliban, that it was in this general area, a very mountainous area and an area near the Kunar Valley, where Osama bin Laden, according to the Taliban, was holed up or had been. Now, what anybody wants to put that in the way of credibility, but just note that Jalalabad is an area where bin Laden is supposedly, he supposed was there over the last 3 to 4 weeks. But of course, that kind of information, no one can vouch for how good it is. But on your map, at least mentally, you might want to mark one reason if bin Laden was in that area. It's an area in which, first of all, there are a lot of mountains around there and mountain caves there. But he also could get pretty easily from that Jalalabad area down into Pakistan. Remember that Osama bin Laden was headquartered for a long time in Peshawar, Pakistan, which is not too far from Jalalabad, across the mountain ranges, the Hindu Kush there. Hindu Kush leads into the Himalayas, which are more off to your right. But it's a very mountainous region, and it would allow Osama bin Laden a lot of leeway going back and forth, if you will, between Afghanistan and Pakistan if he chose to do that. We are still waiting for Tony Blair. The pause there was to make sure that he wasn't coming to the microphones in Great Britain. And as we wait for the British Prime Minister to speak, let's go back to the White House and CBS News correspondent John Roberts. John, we may have to interrupt you if Tony Blair comes up, but what can you tell us?
Well, Dan, I'm just thinking about Tony Blair coming out here. It really has been a 1-2 punch between President Bush and Prime Minister Blair. Blair really being sort of the edge of the sword in Europe to say we're all on board. And of course, it was Blair who delivered some of the toughest language last week aimed at the Taliban. But further to what Mitch Mitchell was saying, not only is the mission defined and the objective clear, but President Bush also saying that the armed forces of the United States will have every tool they need to accomplish their objective. presidents in the past have been somewhat criticized for holding back on exactly how much material and equipment they would give to the armed forces to carry out their goal. President Bush very clearly stating that they would have everything that they need to accomplish their objective. Also, Dan, thinking about the homeland security front here and the threat that Americans may face in the wake of these attacks on Afghanistan, we heard from intelligence sources last week and confirmed by members of Congress who sit on the intelligence committees that indeed intelligence sources have said there is a 100% chance that America could face another terrorist attack as retaliation should we go into Afghanistan. President Bush addressing that today, saying that law enforcement is on high alert. We have every intelligence asset known to the United States out there listening in to all of the threats that are coming in from around the globe. And tomorrow, President Bush will open his Office of Homeland Security. Pennsylvania Governor Tom Ridge will be sworn in as his cabinet-level secretary in charge of Homeland Security. This is an office that will not require Senate confirmation because it does not have statutory authority. And on that particular point, there has been some criticism that perhaps the president is not giving Governor Ridge enough power, that he needs to have budgetary authority over the various departments that he will seek to coordinate. But the president trying to say, at least at this point, that he believes Ridge will have all of the authority, all of the power that he will need to act as a coordinating force among all of the various agencies that will be involved in Homeland Security. Now, we also look at the idea of what happens to Afghanistan now. I mean, it obviously seems that the president is trying to weaken the Taliban to the extent that perhaps they will topple over, and the Northern Alliance could perhaps sweep in and start to take over some of the areas that were under Taliban control. Prime Minister Blair, who we expect to hear from in the next couple of minutes, made it very clear, not only in a speech to his governing Labour Party last week, but also talking to General Pervez Musharraf in Pakistan, that if the Taliban were to fall as a result of this military action, the West will work together in a coordinated fashion to bring together a broadly based coalition to govern Afghanistan. The Northern Alliance, made up mostly of Tajiks and Uzbeks, as well as some ethnic Hazaris, they do not represent the majority population in Afghanistan. That's the Pashtuns, Dan, that you have been talking about. And the Pashtuns saying today that if indeed the Taliban fall, there needs to be convened what they call a loyal jirga, or Grand Council, headed up by the former Afghani king Zahir Shah at its center, to talk about the future of Afghanistan. Now, certainly U.S. officials in Italy have been in touch with former King Shah, 86 years old, not really known how much of an influence he could be, but perhaps at least as a titular head. He is on board to go back to Afghanistan and help to form a government if indeed his services are needed. So, Dan, a lot of balls up in the air right now, and the White House trying to coordinate all of them to the best of their ability to say this war is against the al-Qaeda network, bin Laden, and the Taliban who shelter them. Everyone else we want to try to look after. Dan?
Indeed, John, and just very quickly, because people were an Afghanistan king. Afghanistan had a king until the early 1970s. The Soviet Union then moved into Afghanistan, tried to set up a kind of puppet government. There was a long period there where the Soviets were trying to install a classic puppet communist government. Some of you may remember that the U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan at the time in the mid-1970s was murdered, while a Soviet agent was present when he was murdered. The Soviets failed to install the kind of puppet regime that they'd been able to put in places like Hungary and Czechoslovakia earlier, and so they eventually in late 1979, about Christmas time, invaded Afghanistan with the Red Army, moving the Soviet Army in and saying, look, we've had it with this puppet regime. What they were going to try to do is take over the country, and they tried to put an Afghan army in the field, which kind of propped up by the Soviets. Their problem was that very few of them would fight and wouldn't get out of their vehicles, and the Soviet Union, after virtually a 10-year war, was defeated and withdrew from Afghanistan in 1989. Now, the United States, after a slow start in the 1980s, finally began to pour materiel, including Stinger missiles, to the Afghans during the 1980s. We were their allies. Osama bin Laden was our ally. He was fighting beside the people we were supporting. But in 1989, as the Cold War was coming to an end, the United States, in effect, walked away from Afghanistan. One reason it did so was because everybody said, listen, they're going to have a vicious civil war among themselves now that the Soviets are gone. And indeed, they did have a vicious civil war among themselves. the result of which was the Taliban came to power in the mid-1990s. It came to power with, among other things, support from Pakistan's intelligence of that period. It's pretty much had that support until fairly recently from some elements in Pakistan. And yes, you could say deep back there in the very early stages, because the effort was to get Afghan refugees out of northern Pakistan back into Afghanistan, that the American CIA may have had something to do with that. But that's sort of the history that goes back to the king. Nobody expects in the post-Taliban dictatorship period of Afghanistan, if indeed that is to come, nobody expects the king to come back and take over, at least not for long, because as John mentioned, he's about 86 years old. Let's go back to Mitch Mitchell, our retired U.S. Army general who's our consultant. Mitch, as these attacks continue, there's no doubt that they're occurring over the length and breadth of Afghanistan, aimed for the moment primarily at military targets, with the food drops to follow once daylight comes.
Yes, absolutely, Dan. I'm sure that the people who have done the targeting have been given very close instructions not to hit civilian targets, if at all possible. Now, there are military targets interspersed with the civilian communities in the big cities, and you can hear the earlier reports from Kabul that we're not striking them yet. However, you don't have to strike them from the air necessarily. There are other ways to take out those targets. It takes a little longer, a little more difficult, but it can be done. So it appears that we are doing what we said before. We're going to prepare this battlefield, and then we're going to go in and do the humanitarian operation. I believe we're going to have to, in future drops, bring the food and supplies that the Afghan people need in closer to them and help, possibly even help with the distribution of it. That also means people on the ground, but that'll probably be for a later phase.
Mitch Mitchell in our Washington Bureau. About 40 countries are cooperating in many ways, according to President Bush. This included offering landing rights or airspace for U.S. aircraft. President Bush said, quote, "We are supported by the collective will of the world," quote, unquote. Of course, what the president didn't say and couldn't say in the context of this address is that some of the allies in the coalition have been reluctant, to say the least. Some of them have been wandering and wavering as it goes along. But as Secretary of State Colin Powell has been saying, this is a whole new kind of war. And one of the things the President, the Secretary of State, the Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld have been trying to do is put together the best coalition that they can. The fact that it's not a perfect coalition, they have said in one way or another repeatedly, doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to get what help we can. In some cases, the help may just simply be being able to plug in to other countries' intelligence. Here is Tony Blair speaking for the British
announcement
people.
by President Bush, military action against targets inside Afghanistan has begun. I can confirm that UK forces are engaged in this action. I want to pay tribute, if I might, right at the outset, to Britain's armed forces. There is no greater strength for a British Prime Minister and the British nation at a time like this than to know that the forces we are calling upon are amongst the very best in the world. They and their families are of course carrying an immense burden at this moment and will be feeling deep anxiety, as will the British people. But we can take pride in their courage, their sense of duty, and the esteem with which they're held throughout the world. No country lightly commits forces to military action and the inevitable risks involved. But we made it clear, following the attacks upon the United States on September the 11th, that we would take part in action once it was clear who was responsible. There is no doubt in my mind, nor in the mind of anyone who has been through all the available evidence, including intelligence material, that these attacks were carried out by the Al-Qaeda network masterminded by Osama bin Laden. Equally, it is clear that his network is harbored and supported by the Taliban regime inside Afghanistan. It is now almost a month since the atrocity occurred. It is more than 2 weeks since an ultimatum was delivered to the Taliban to yield up the terrorists or face the consequences. It is clear beyond doubt that they will not do this. They were given the choice of siding with justice or siding with terror, and they chose to side with terror. There are three parts, all equally important to the operation in which we're engaged: military, diplomatic, and humanitarian. The military action we are taking will be targeted against places we know to be involved in the Al-Qaeda network of terror or against the military apparatus of the Taliban. This military plan has been put together mindful of our determination to do all we humanly can to avoid civilian casualties. I cannot disclose, obviously, how long this action will last, but we will act with reason and resolve. We have set the objectives to eradicate Osama bin Laden's network of terror and to take action against the Taliban regime that is sponsoring him. As to the precise British involvement, I can confirm that last Wednesday, the United States government made a specific request that a number of UK military assets be used in the operation which has now begun, and I gave authority for these assets to be deployed. They include the base at Diego Garcia, reconnaissance and other aircraft, and missile-firing submarines. The missile-firing submarines are in use tonight. The air assets will be available for use in the coming days. The United States are obviously providing the bulk of the force required and leading this operation. But this is an international effort. As well as the UK, France, Germany, Australia, and Canada have also committed themselves to take part in it. On the diplomatic and political front, in the time I've been Prime Minister, I cannot recall a situation that has commanded so quickly such a powerful coalition of support, and not just from those countries directly involved in military action, but from many others in all parts of the world. That coalition has, I believe, strengthened, not weakened, in the 26 days since the atrocity occurred. And this is in no small measure due to the statesmanship of President Bush, to whom I pay tribute tonight. The world understands that whilst of course there are dangers in acting, the dangers of inaction are far, far greater. The threat of further such outrages, the threat to our economies, the threat to the stability of the world. On the humanitarian front, we are assembling a coalition of support for refugees in and outside Afghanistan, which is as vital as the military coalition. Even before September the 11th, 4 million Afghans were on the move. There are 2 million refugees in Pakistan and 1.5 million in Iran. We have to act for humanitarian reasons to alleviate the appalling suffering of the Afghan people and to deliver stability so that people from that region stay in that region. Britain, of course, is heavily involved in that humanitarian effort. So we are taking action, therefore, on all those three fronts: military, diplomatic, and humanitarian. I also want to say very directly to the British people why this matters so much directly to Britain. First, let us not forget that the attacks of September the 11th represented the worst terrorist outrage against British citizens in our history. The murder of British citizens, whether it happens overseas or not, is an attack upon Britain. But even if no British citizen had died, it would be right to act. This atrocity was an attack on us all, on people of all faiths and people of none. We know the Al-Qaeda network threatened Europe, including Britain, and indeed any nation throughout the world that does not share their fanatical views. So we have a direct interest in acting in our own self-defense to protect British lives. It was also an attack not just on lives but on livelihoods. We can see since the 11th of September how economic confidence has suffered, with all that means for British jobs and British industry. Our prosperity and standard of living, therefore, require us to deal with this terrorist threat. We act also because the Al-Qaeda network and the Taliban regime are funded in large part on the drugs trade. 90% of all the heroin sold on British streets originates from Afghanistan. Stopping that trade is again directly in our interests. I wish to say finally, as I've said many times before, that this is not a war with Islam. It angers me, as it angers the vast majority of Muslims, to hear bin Laden and his associates described as Islamic terrorists. They are terrorists, pure and simple. Islam is a peaceful and tolerant religion, and the acts of these people are wholly contrary to the teachings of the Quran. These are difficult and testing times, therefore, for all of us. People are bound to be concerned about what the terrorists may seek to do in response. I should say there is at present no specific credible threat to the UK that we know of, and that we have in place tried and tested contingency plans which are the best possible response to any further attempts at terror. This, of course, is a moment of the utmost gravity for the world. None of the leaders involved in this action want war. None of our nations want it. We are a peaceful people. But we know that sometimes, to safeguard peace, we have to fight. Britain has learnt that lesson many times before in our history. We only do it if the cause is just, but this cause is just. The murder of almost 7,000 innocent people in America was an attack on our freedom, our way of life, an attack on civilized values the world over. We waited so that those responsible could be yielded up by those shielding them. That offer was refused. We have now no choice. So we will act, and our determination in acting is total. We will not let up or rest until our objectives are met in full. Thank you.
The Prime Minister of Great Britain speaking live from number 10 Downing Street. Now, here is the latest from CBS News. Operation Enduring Freedom, the U.S. retaliation against Osama bin Laden and Afghanistan's Taliban rulers is underway. U.S. Tomahawk cruise missiles delivered the first blows, hitting military targets near the capital city of Kabul, as well as other targets across the country, including the Taliban's military headquarters in Kandahar, which initial reports indicate has been heavily damaged, perhaps even destroyed. Other airstrikes are being delivered by, besides British missiles, being delivered by American B-1, B-2, and B-52 bombers. President Bush addressed the nation from the White House about an hour ago.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. These carefully targeted actions are designed to disrupt the use of Afghanistan as a terrorist base of operations and to attack the military capability of the Taliban regime.
Other headlines. The U.S. is getting aid from more than 40 countries, aid of one kind or another. Britain is taking direct part in the airstrikes. U.S. officials say the nation is now on high state of alert now that the U.S. airstrikes have begun. American relief flights to aid Afghan refugees are scheduled to begin food drops tomorrow morning, Afghanistan time, flying in from Western Europe. Let's go to CBS's David Martin at the Pentagon. David?
Dan, the airdrops of food will begin after a night of air strikes which are designed to eliminate or at least disrupt the Taliban military capabilities. The transport planes that drop the food will fly at a very high altitude out of range of Stinger shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles, which you cannot count on destroying with airstrikes. So there should be no danger to the planes. The point of these airdrops is to get food to people who are starving now, to stop them from fleeing into neighboring countries like Pakistan, and to convince them that this is not a war against the Afghan people, this is a war against the Taliban.
David Martin at the Pentagon. That's the latest news at this hour. Now, emphasizing that the strategy is bombs to be followed by bread. Bombs and bread. This is the operation. First, the bombs, they have been going on for, well over 2 hours now, and that's expected to continue for some hours yet. And then when daylight comes in Afghanistan, planes from Western Europe flying at very high altitude, large transports, will begin dropping food into Afghanistan. I want to go back to David Martin for a moment now. David, we've talked about these airstrikes, the B-1s and B-52s coming from Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, the stealth bombers coming from their base in Missouri, and the cruise Tomahawk missiles being fired from both surface ships, submarines. Would some of those also be fired from aircraft? Check me as we go here. Now, what about Uzbekistan? There were these 1,000 U.S. soldiers moved to Uzbekistan several days ago. Uzbekistan, anything flying out of Uzbekistan?
Not that I know of, Dan. Those, and I guess I should say we should hope that nothing is flying out of Uzbekistan, because the units that went in there were primarily search and rescue to go into Afghanistan in an attempt to rescue any downed pilots. Dan, excuse me while I take this phone call.
David Martin at the Pentagon, and when he turns to take a phone call like that, some, in David's case, really good sources calling him, so we'll get back to David shortly. Now, Prime Minister Blair said a few minutes ago that Germany, France, Australia, and Canada are committed to, quote, take part in the action against Afghanistan. Exactly what role they will play, we do not know. Blair made it clear that British weapons were being used. And that would include firing missiles from submarines. And you say, well, what kind of missiles can they fire from submarines? You may remember during the Gulf War, and we've had this capability since sometime in the late 1950s and early 1960s, you can fire a version of the cruise missile, yes, from underwater if necessary, and it comes out and goes to target thousands of miles away. And of course, the submarines can also fire those missiles while surfaced, I believe. Now, Islamabad, Pakistan, the Taliban describes the U.S. strike, and I quote, a terrorist attack, and says America will never achieve its goals. You may want to note that the Taliban says that what the U.S. is doing today is a terrorist attack. Now, other headlines of the hour include the United States being put, in terms of its citizenry in this country, on a higher alert because there was a widespread belief, nobody had or could have any proof positive, but a widespread belief that when and if the United States began to take military measures against the Taliban in Afghanistan, that there would be efforts made to do other bad things in this country. So the country as a whole, as far as the United States is concerned, is on its version of a high alert. I would say those alerts are possibly higher in big cities and, of course, in Washington, D.C. CBS News correspondent Liz Palmer, who normally operates out of Moscow but has been doing such a terrific job for tough weeks in northern Afghanistan, is up now. Liz, what can you tell us?
We've just managed to get through to the commander of this entire northeast front on his satellite phone, Mohibullah Khan, and he told us that a very important strategic stronghold of the Taliban has also been hit by American bombs tonight. It's very important because it has a very rare and big airstrip here. The Taliban captured it from the United Front about a year and a half ago. It was a big blow to the Northern Alliance, the United Front. And it appears that the bombs have struck the airstrip specifically. Again, we see this pattern of avoiding civilian targets and going for if you like, the most important tools of the Taliban and their fighting machine. Dan.
Thank you, Liz. We speak often of this Northern Alliance, and we've said before and say again, while it can be important in the effort to crumble the Taliban from within, or at the very least force them to give up Osama bin Laden, close down the terrorist camps, that it also would be a mistake to overestimate their military prowess. They would not appreciate that being said, but it's true. That until the United States now got reinterested, if you will, in Afghanistan, and given these military strikes, the Northern Alliance is made up of minority, primarily, people from minority tribes in Afghanistan, where the Taliban represents the tribe that the Taliban comes from represents about 40% of the people. We always want to make it clear that doesn't mean the Taliban dictatorship represents 40% of the people in Afghanistan. It is to say the Taliban, that their main, the Pashtun tribe, it represents about 40% of Afghanistan's 25 million people. And let's go back to David Martin at the Pentagon now.
Dan, one piece of information about the targets. One of the categories of targets on the list that the government wanted to hit, I don't know if they've been hit yet, were the warehouses where the Taliban stores the opium from or the opiate from the poppy fields in Afghanistan. This is a major source of revenue for the Taliban, and to deny them that is the equivalent of going after their financial network. Now, I heard British Prime Minister Tony Blair say that Osama bin Laden is deeply involved in this drug trade and gets his money from that drug trade. That is something that you cannot get confirmed from U.S. intelligence. But I think it may be a distinction without a difference if the money is going to support the Taliban, who in turn allows Osama bin Laden to work from their country. One interesting point about how long the clock has been ticking down toward H hour today. The decision to launch these strikes was made before Defense Secretary Rumsfeld left on his trip, his whirlwind trip to the Middle East and to Central Asia. At the time, there was a lot of speculation that some of the bases, some of the countries that were providing bases that we would need, such as Saudi Arabia and Uzbekistan, had suddenly gotten cold feet and were not going to allow us to use those bases. It now appears that he was simply going almost out of respect to give them some sort of notice that these strikes were coming, and to thank them at a very high level for allowing the U.S. to use its bases. But he left, it's all a blur now, but I think he left on Wednesday or maybe Tuesday night. So that backs that decision up quite a number of days.
David, as a result of the Gulf War, the United States put a command operation in Saudi Arabia. It's one of the things Osama bin Laden complains about. That command operation, is it in effect sort of the regional command, keeping in mind that the overall command comes out of Tampa, Florida, does it not?
But that's where the air war is being coordinated from. They took something else from the Gulf War and put it over in Saudi Arabia. It was an Air Force general named David Deptula, who was one of the architects of the air war against Iraq, was quietly transferred from his office here in the Pentagon over to Saudi Arabia to work with the battle staff in coming up for these plans. So it's more than just coincidence that these strikes, at least from our vantage point, look an awful lot like some of the early strikes against Iraq.
David Martin, the Pentagon, keep in mind that the theater commander, so-called CENTCOM, which stands for Central Command Commander, is General, four-star General Tommy Franks of the U.S. Army. And he is presumably at CENTCOM, the Central Command headquarters at MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa, Florida. The air operations, as David mentioned, are being run by Major General, that's two-star General David Deptula of the U.S. Air Force. General Deptula is at the Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia. Now, the Commander of Special Operations, which we haven't heard much about, and it's just as well, but these are the people who have to put boots on the ground and fight through the lice, the scorpions, the dust, and indeed the blood to do what it is that Special Ops is required to do. General Charlie Holland of the U.S. Air Force, who's also at MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa, Florida. You may want to note that the State Department has put out a briefing paper in which it emphasizes, and I quote, these operations, that is the military operations underway in Afghanistan now, these operations are designed with care and precision to avoid civilian casualties and go after al-Qaeda camps and the military infrastructure that sustains the Taliban. So if somebody asks you, or you ask yourself, say, well, what is it we're trying to do in there? It can't be stated much more clearly than this, and I'll repeat it. These operations are designed with care and precision to avoid civilian casualties and go after al-Qaeda camps and the military infrastructure that sustains the Taliban. And the key word there is they're designed to avoid civilian casualties. That isn't to say that you can use these kind of weapons and have no civilian casualties. One could hope for that, but in the real world of real war, that simply is not possible using these kind of weapons. Now, the State Department also goes out of its way to say, and I quote, we are mindful of the 2 Americans and others detained in Afghanistan. As the President said, they should be released immediately. Detained, of course, is a gentle diplomatic word for imprisoned. There are 2 Americans, 2 Australians, and 4 Germans. They all work for the German-run aid organization Shelter Now. They were arrested August 3rd. They were accused of trying to convert local Muslims to Christianity. 16 Afghans were also arrested with them. Now, joining us now is General Fogelman, the former Air Force Chief of Staff. General, I know you just flew in. Thanks for being here. You commanded the Air Force as Chief of Staff until fairly recently. Give us your perspective on what our young men and women are doing at this hour.
Well, Dan, I think fundamentally there are 2 missions that are being performed over there. As you stated, the first one is to try and take down the Taliban military capability, such as it may be. And there we're targeting command and control facilities, known military bases, any kind of infrastructure they have that would contribute to any kind of air defense. We're doing that, I think, in anticipation of the next phase of this operation.
Which would be what?
I suspect that what we're really after, or quite frankly, what we're going to do is we are going to create a set of conditions in Afghanistan where we will own their airspace. And that will then allow us to operate not with impunity, because while we can generally take down the more sophisticated stuff, the fighters and the radar-guided surface-to-air missiles, the fact that they have so many of these shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles will make it difficult to operate in certain altitude regimes. But the purpose is to basically denude them of any air defense capability, which then allows us to do the things that we need to do, such as the humanitarian airdrop that we will see as a part of the follow-on here. And then following that, I think that we will see many of the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets that we need to track people on the ground, to monitor almost on a real-time basis what is going on within the country. So that, I think, is one part of this operation. The other part of the operation is clearly aimed at the terrorist infrastructure, if you will. They're going to go after the terrorist camps. They're going to try and set some conditions that will get the terrorists on the move, because once you get these people moving around, you increase your chances that you're going to be able to pick them up and actually then be able to engage them directly.
General, why would they not just hunker down rather than move around?
Well, that's a possibility. You could, and but the fact of the matter is, if they hunker down, they have to be supported in one way or another. And what you begin to look for is any kind of movement, if you will, whether it's electronic or whether it's physical, that starts to give you clues about where these people may be.
General, when the President spoke to the American people, he emphasized that these operations, this military operation that's now underway, is concentrated in Afghanistan, but he spoke of the broader mission. Now, what about camps outside Afghanistan?
Well, I think that, first of all, our intelligence is such that I believe that we know with a high degree of certainty where those camps are. And
excuse me, the ones outside
outside of Afghanistan, as well as the ones inside of Afghanistan. I think the thing that will determine whether or not we strike these other camps will be the way in which the nations respond to his call for joining the coalition. In other words, the camps that may be in some other nations, whether we strike them or not will be determined by whether these people choose to be with us or against us in this thing.
Now, just after the President's speech, I emphasized that the President himself did not say this, but by mentioning a broader possible mission in future, it sounded as if it was a version of, you see what's happening in Afghanistan, it's your decision. If you want some of this, you just keep on doing what you're doing by aiding and abetting these terrorists. If you don't, then help us wipe out the camps in your country. Would that be a fair analysis in your opinion?
Well, I think clearly what he's doing is he's giving countries the opportunity to either step up and be on our side or not. And I would anticipate that if we were to strike terrorist camps in other nations that chose to align themselves with the terrorists rather than with us, that in one sense, those will be more symbolic strikes than they will be something in which we really hope to catch terrorists in the camps, because clearly they've had a lot of warning. They're probably not present. On the other hand, I'm led to believe that the kinds of strikes you're going to see against the terrorist camps in Afghanistan are not going to be what we've seen in the past. That is, maybe 6 or 8 aim points with the TLAMs or the conventional, the
TLAM is what, Jimmy?
This is the sea-launched Tomahawk.
Right.
And then you have the conventional air-launched cruise missiles that come off the B-52s. I think that they're putting those munitions on more of the higher priority Taliban kinds of targets.
Airstrips, radar installations.
Command and control, intelligence centers, things like that we have a fair amount of intelligence that we know where they're at, those kinds of things. I think what you're going to see in these terrorist camps, in addition to the normal kinds of strikes we've seen in the past, is you're going to see the employment of massive bombing, unlike anything that anybody has seen since Vietnam. Almost B-52, B-1 carpet bombing kinds of things to just literally obliterate the landscape in the vicinity of these things.
With that in mind, General, what about the view which has been expressed by some people in the United States, and this includes very patriotic people, saying, well, look, you do that kind of bombing in Afghanistan, it's not making them into a parking lot, you bomb them up to a parking lot. Are there targets that can be hit with any real efficiency by carpet bombing kind of techniques?
Well, I don't think you're going to see the carpet bombing take place in urban areas. In other words, these are these very remote camps or semi-remote camps, and the idea here is if you want to hide in a cave, and you remember from our experience in Vietnam, that when we start to use these kinds of munitions in this way, that we have the opportunity to change the fusing on the bombs so that you get some of them that explode on the surface, some penetrate. It's an opportunity to work on the minds of these terrorists, particularly if they decide they want to go underground. And so I think, again, this is just one dimension of what you're going to see. This is going to be over the next several hours, a massive application of air power from sea launch platforms, land-based platforms, the whole spectrum of air power that we have. We're using space-based assets to give us feedback on what's happening while we do this. And then we will start to roll into the next phase, which I suspect will include the humanitarian airdrops that have been talked about. And then following that, sort of an assessment, and then they'll determine what they want to use and where they want to go next.
General, we never at any time on any of our broadcasts want to place any single American in danger if we can possibly avoid it. And not only I know you agree with that, but I just think it's important for our viewers to know.
Absolutely.
And particularly when I ask you this next question, but you've talked about saying, look, this is just the first stage of things. We know the second stage is going to be, in effect, bomb them with bread, that is humanitarian relief. Dropped, I'm given to believe, first at least from high altitude. Now I know from my own limited experience in the Kosovo War and some other places, when you drop that kind of humanitarian relief from high altitude, it scatters all over, almost literally over hills, half acre, so to speak, and some of it doesn't get down in very good shape. So why drop it?
Well, Dan, actually, we have some pretty recent experience with humanitarian airdrops and in Bosnia. And quite frankly, when we started, we weren't very good at it.
That must have been when I saw it.
Yeah, well, I hope that we have some good footage of the follow-on humanitarian drops that we did. Interesting, if I could just tell a little war story about humanitarian airdrops, and basically how it starts. First of all, the food that will be dropped in Afghanistan, I'm led to believe, is what we call HDR, or HDRs, which is an abbreviation for humanitarian daily rations. It's a little bit of a takeoff on the U.S. military's MREs, their military rations that they do. When we started dropping food in Bosnia, the first thing we did is we packaged these MREs up in huge cardboard boxes, had parachutes on them. We threw these things out. the folks who needed the food badly would come rushing out, and we were actually injuring people with these things coming down. Then some very bright, probably young enlisted troop took a look at these MRE packages. You know, they're made out of plastic, they're relatively flat, and he discovered that they had aerodynamic features. And so we quit dropping them in boxes, and we just started pushing these things out the back, and they sort of fluttered down
like a frisbee.
Like a frisbee. And sure enough, you can go run computer modeling to see how these things actually fly through the air when you know what the wind is at altitude, etc. And so when we start these humanitarian airdrops, I suspect that what you're going to see are these HDRs being dropped in this fashion. And yes, some of them will probably end up in the hands of the bad guys. But the bulk of them are going to get to the people who need it, the Afghan citizens who have been ravished by this drought and been displaced from their homes.
Now, is it the expectation, General, or not, that this doesn't just go on for the next 12 to 24 hours? If I'm hearing you correctly, you're outlining something that will have phase after phase for at least several days.
Well, Dan, again, if I could go back to your point about never jeopardizing U.S. troops, I have to be right up front and say that in my contacts with anybody within the government, I have asked them to very carefully not give me any classified information because I don't want to divulge that, and I might inadvertently do it. But I have been part of these kinds of operations. My job prior to my last job is I was the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Transportation Command. So I was engaged in a lot of this movement of troops and these kinds of operations. So what I am really outlining for you is that the most likely case, given where we're at and what I know from unclassified sources. And so with that in mind, that's what I say, this is an initial phase. This is, in one sense, you could call this the kinetic phase. There's kinetic weapons going off all over the place. There's flashes on the horizons, etc. We will, as you normally do in this, we will continue to have air assets airborne that are capable of responding very quickly if you have a fleeting target or if these airlift aircraft are in danger. But then we go through this, what we call battle damage assessment, if you will. How successful were we in striking what it was we were going to strike? Is there a requirement for a follow-up series of attacks, if you will, with bombs and missiles? If the assessment is no, then sometimes you accelerate the plan and you can get on with the next phase. But you have to plan sequentially because you have all these assets coming around.
Gentlemen, we'll pause and take a picture of
United
Osama bin
States.
Laden reading a statement. I don't know when the statement was given. Let's take a listen.
And God will help them to do that. And when they respond to defend their weak people, in many of the Muslim people, the whole world shout and cry, and innocent children are being killed at this time in Iraq without any reason, without any cause that they did. And we don't hear anybody saying anything or any fatwa to say anything about. And also the tanks, the Israeli tanks in Palestine and in Ramallah and Rafah and Ben Jala and all other Islamic countries. And we don't hear anybody saying anything. And when after 80 years, if anything happened to the United States, everybody start to talk and nobody talk about the holy lands of the Muslim people. They follow the wrong way and they support And they support the wrong side, and God will show them. It is clear and obvious that after that, it's upon every Muslim, even in the United States, they should cut the head of the. They came out with their men and with their horses to support they came out and they tried to destroy Islam and fight Islam. People from everywhere, from Japan, young and old. This is not an. When something happened in Iraq, when people killed in Nairobi, and everybody started to talk about the attack on this. These incidents divide the whole world into two parts. One is the hypocritic part, and the other part is the Muslim part. And every Muslim has to support his religion and his Islam to fight the atrocity. And to the United States and its people, I swear to God, who lift up the heaven, lift up the sky, United States, or the people living in United States, they will not suffer. They will not have any safe life. In the name of God and Muhammad, his prophet, and God will support and get Islam victorious.
Now, what you've been hearing is the translator's voice over what can only be described as a weird deal. Osama bin Laden said in a statement read by an aide in Cairo that the war against Afghanistan and him is, quote, war on Islam. Then this video popped up. When this video was made, this is important, when this video was made and where it was made, we do not know. The belief would run strong until there's some sort of empirical evidence to the contrary that the video was pre-positioned, if you will, to be played when American military strikes started, which they have now done. Now, bin Laden, as you saw, he was dressed in fatigues, and they looked remarkably, General Fogelman, like, if not American fatigues, something very close to American fatigues. We couldn't tell for sure. He was dressed in fatigues and the traditional Afghan headdress. Keep in mind, Osama bin Laden is a Saudi Arabian. He's not an Afghan, but he's been an Afghan until inside Afghanistan. He had on the traditional Afghan headdress. He was sitting for a while rather quietly next to his spokesman as the spokesman read the statement. This was all on the video. And then, you saw bin Laden himself, or let me say, with a reporter's skepticism, not cynicism, but skepticism. If this was not Osama bin Laden, he is clearly the winner of the Osama bin Laden look-alike contest. That we assume nothing here when we're presented with this kind of material. Now, it was not clear when this video was made nor where it was made. It did refer to the September 11th attacks in the United States, as you may have heard, but it did not refer to today's strikes by the U.S. And Britain weaponry. So that's as much as we know about this. Perhaps more details will be coming, but I wouldn't bet the rent money on it. Let's turn to Fuad Ajami, the distinguished professor at Johns Hopkins University and our CBS News consultant. Fuad, you've been watching what's happening today. You just heard this alleged video made by, a video allegedly made by Osama bin Laden. help us here to get some perspective.
I think your cautionary note is in order. I think that's what we should view this with some skepticism. There are two people, and we know who they are. There is one interesting customer who led up to bin Laden, and that's a doctor, a physician, Ayman Zawahiri, who's an enemy of the regime, Hosni Mubarak. This is the heir apparent of Osama bin Laden.
Egyptian.
Absolutely. This is a man who was involved in the assassination of Anwar Sadat 20 years ago. He was imprisoned, he was tortured, and then he took to the road, and then eventually became a partner of Osama bin Laden, and has vowed that he will only go back to Egypt as a conqueror. So this is the Egyptian trail. This is the Egyptian part of the Osama bin Laden Qaeda, the operation of Osama bin Laden and the Terror International. Now, of course, the second statement was Osama bin Laden. You're absolutely right. We don't know when. Obviously, we do know it's after September 11, but we don't know if it's today or the day before. And it's Osama bin Laden at his best, if you will. If you hear it in Arabic, if you hear it the way it plays in his own neighborhood, it's Osama bin Laden appealing to pan-Islam. This to him is not a campaign against terrorism. It's a clash with civilization. It's a war between America and the Islamic world. So
it's exactly what we're trying to avoid.
Yes, it's exactly what he's trying to provoke, because he wants to scare us away from the Islamic world.
Well, this is the way the wire services are handling this. Bin Laden blasts Arab leaders for not reacting to Israeli attacks on Palestinians. Bin Laden says Bush is head of infidels. That's a quote. Bin Laden swears America will not live in peace before peace reigns in Palestine. And then Osama bin Laden and Taliban leader Mullah Muhammad Omar, according to the Taliban ambassador in Islamabad, Pakistan, are still alive after the attacks, and one can make of that what they would. But General Fogelman, I want to go back to when this kind of operation, the assumption has been that bin Laden is in Afghanistan with that kind of intelligence. Again, I know you're not privy to the current intelligence, but with that kind of intelligence, is the belief, well, yeah, we have this intelligence, so he's there, or is it taken with skepticism and say, listen, he could be there, he could be back in Pakistan, we don't know where he is?
Well, I'm not, as you say, I'm not privy to the latest intelligence on this, but in the past, even with the limited human intelligence resources that we have, we've been able to fairly well determine at least what country this guy is in and how he's operating. If you remember, after the 98 embassy bombings, we actually increased our intelligence gathering efforts in this arena. And quite frankly, it is information that I have been given is that we had very good intelligence on where his location was at that time, so much so that the administration was actually briefed on options to go in and try to bring him out. And the decision was made primarily, I'm told, on the basis of not taking casualties, that instead of using U.S. forces, our highly trained forces, to go in and try to do that, that we elected to try and use surrogate forces. And those surrogate forces were able to, in fact, track him, make an attack on one of his convoys, but unfortunately did not get him. So this is a very sophisticated, slippery individual. He's got to live in this environment. But in the end, he is not a Superman. And I think that when you concentrate the efforts of the world, when you go beyond just pure military action and start to employ diplomatic, economic, all these kinds of pressures, that this guy's going to slip up. And when he does, clearly as a result of the 12th of September, the administration is reading the American public and saying that we're willing to take some casualties if we have to go get this guy.
I'll return to Fuad of Jami. Fuad, I thought it was interesting, help me as you go along here, sure, that in this alleged bin Laden appearance on this video, that he tied what he has been doing and what he hopes to do to Palestine and to all the difficulties in the Middle East with Israel. It seems to me that in the not too distant past, Osama bin Laden was fixed on the infidels in the Holy Land of Saudi Arabia, and he didn't care about the Palestinians and the Israelis and that, but he'd never said very much about it before.
You're absolutely right. He'll pick it up where he can. I mean, the idea is to embarrass the Arab governments. The idea is to appeal to the Arab people, to the Islamic people, over the heads of their government and to frighten these governments with sacred symbols, to talk about Palestine, to talk about the Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, to talk about the Iraqi children as he has, to talk about the American presence in the sacred earth of Arabia. And he has, in many ways, we should admit, rattled some of these governments, because in effect we've drawn back a bit from using Pakistan as a base for an American launching attack against the Taliban. So it is really a fight for the hearts and minds of the Islamic world. We are saying there is no middle ground between Osama bin Laden, terrorism on the one hand, and the forces of order on the other. And the Islamic governments are caught right smack in the middle.
Let's pick up Alan Pizzi, who's in Pakistan. Alan, if you're still there, come in. You've been listening to some of this discussion and give us a perspective from there, virtually on the Afghanistan border on the Pakistan side.
Dan, we're hearing from the Afghanis here. As you mentioned earlier on, they called these attacks a terrorist attack. And the ambassador here was quoted as saying America has responded to Taliban offers to negotiate with what he called arrogance and power. They say they'll never surrender and they'll never give up Osama bin Laden. I've been talking to a lot of people here with connections inside Afghanistan, people that are working to get some other kind of a government. And a couple of them have said to us, look, let's think about this in another way. The Afghan people may be hostage to the Taliban, but perhaps the Taliban is hostage to Osama bin Laden. Remember, he's got about 3,000 or more heavily committed, well-trained fighters around him. The Taliban doesn't necessarily have that many committed people. We've seen some defections already. Bin Laden is a very potent and powerful force. He's got a lot of money. The Taliban's probably broke. And as Fuad mentioned, he appeals to the Islamic world in a different way. He portrays himself as a champion of Islam, portrays America as a demon fighting against Islam. And that's a technique that's proved successful, for example, for Saddam Hussein. He attacked a brother Arab country, Kuwait, and yet came off as the victim of the whole thing because he appeals to the street level of the Arab world, of the Islamic world, and it's a very basic kind of appeal. And there are people here who will tell you, look, the Taliban is not necessarily totally the bad guy. Osama bin Laden, you're going after Osama, he's the bad guy, but you've got to be careful not to demonize totally the Taliban, because there are people in there who would be willing to defect, who would be willing to work with another kind of government. One of the big movements that's going on here is the call for a Loya Jirga. That's a traditional gathering of Afghan elders, clerics, tribal leaders. Remember, Afghanistan was basically formed as we know it in the mid-18th century with the first Loya Jirga. And the people that are working to set up one of these things under the aegis of King Zahir Shah, no one expects him to take over. He's 86 years old, but he is a force that they could rally around to have one of these gatherings to solve what's a major political crisis. And people are saying the Taliban has to be part of this. So getting bin Laden may actually help the Taliban a little bit. Destroying the Taliban won't necessarily help solve this whole problem. The Taliban is also saying they will never give up bin Laden. That's, as I say, maybe because they can't, who knows, but that's the way they're looking at it now, Dan.
Alan Pizzi in Quetta, Pakistan. Quote Osama bin Laden or someone who claimed to be Osama bin Laden in a videotape. We don't know when it was made, don't know where it was made. We're going to play some of this for you again now, just so you have a look. We don't have the translation on this particular part of it, but at one point, I'm not sure it's at this point in the videotape, what is purported to be Osama bin Laden said, and I quote him, speaking of September 11th, tells you that this video was made after September 11th, but because there was no notation about today's attacks, the belief runs strong. No one can say for sure that this was prepositioned to be played when the U.S. strike started. But quoting Osama bin Laden, he said at one point, speaking of September 11th, America was hit by God in one of its softest spots. America is full of fear from its north to its south, from its west to its east. Thank God for that. And then continuing to say that I'm not sure that bin Laden is saying it, the man who purports to be bin Laden in this videotape saying it right now, but he also said, when the sword falls on the United States, they cry for their children, unquote. And quote again, "The least you can say about these people," that is Americans, "is that they are sinners. They have helped evil triumph over good." Now, that's some of what Osama bin Laden said. And this was this videotape. It came suddenly and without any preconditioning, if you will. It just came up on this outfit in Qatar, which passes along frequently, the Al Jazeera organization, and they don't vouch for the video. It comes up. They say this was given to us by operatives that we know are connected to Osama bin Laden through third or fourth hand or what have you, and they put it up. They don't vouch for it. Now, we want to go by telephone now to the Northern Coalition in northern Afghanistan because, and we're going to try to take you there to our correspondent, that dateline Tajikistan, the anti-Taliban forces in northern Afghanistan plan to launch their, quote, own offensive in coordination with the foreign, that would be U.S. airstrikes. In Tajikistan, this word came from what's described as an opposition diplomat. Whether any or all of that is true or not, we don't know, but let's go to CBS News correspondent Jim Axelrod, who filed this report from the Panjshir Valley in Afghanistan.
Yeah, we're at the top of a mountain called Tok Dara. It's about 20 miles, less than 20 miles from Kabul. And we're at the top of this mountain hearing a number of loud booms, real rumbling booms, and then some flashes. We're tucked in about, less than a mile, I should say, about 1,000 meters from the front line here, kind of tucked in behind a stone wall. Everyone's telling us to stay low because the Taliban does have positions less than a mile away. But we have a clear, unobstructed view as we look south towards Kabul. The moon's about 3/5 full, so there's a lot of light, a lot of stars, and the rumbling and the booms have just started to pick up within the last 5 or 10 minutes or so. We're still waiting to see the booms. And
that we will use.
Well, we're cutting off Jim Axelrod because Don Rumsfeld has started his briefing at the Defense Department. We go to that
Today,
live.
the President has turned to direct, overt military force to complement the economic, humanitarian, financial, and diplomatic activities which are already well underway. The effect we hope to achieve through these raids, which together with our coalition partners we have initiated today, is to create conditions for sustained anti-terrorist and humanitarian relief operations in Afghanistan. That requires that, among other things, we first remove the threat from air defenses and from Taliban aircraft. We also seek to raise the cost of doing business for foreign terrorists who have chosen Afghanistan from which to organize their activities, and for the oppressive Taliban regime that continues to tolerate terrorist presence in those portions of Afghanistan which they control. The current military operations are focused on achieving several outcomes. To make clear to the Taliban leaders and their supporters that harboring terrorists is unacceptable and carries a price. To acquire intelligence to facilitate future operations against al-Qaeda and the Taliban regime that harbors the terrorists. To develop relationships with groups in Afghanistan that oppose the Taliban regime and the foreign terrorists that they support. To make it increasingly difficult for the terrorists to use Afghanistan freely as a base of operation. And to alter the military balance over time by denying to the Taliban the offensive systems that hamper the progress of the various opposition forces, and to provide humanitarian relief to Afghans suffering truly oppressive living conditions under the Taliban regime. I want to reiterate a point that President Bush has made often and that he made again today in his remarks. The United States has organized armed coalitions on several occasions since the Cold War for the purpose of denying hostile regimes the opportunity to oppress their own people and other people. In Kuwait, in northern Iraq, in Somalia, Bosnia, and Kosovo, the United States took action on behalf of Muslim populations against outside invaders and oppressive regimes. The same is true today. We stand with those Afghans who are being repressed by a regime that abuses the very people it purports to lead and that harbors terrorists who have attacked and killed thousands of innocents around the world of all religions, of all races, and of all nationalities. While our raids today focus on the Taliban and the foreign terrorists in Afghanistan, our aim remains much broader. Our objective is to defeat those who use terrorism and those who house or support them. The world stands united in this effort. It is not about a religion or an individual terrorist or a country. Our partners in this effort represent nations and peoples of all cultures, all religions, and all races. We share the belief that terrorism is a cancer on the human condition, and we intend to oppose it wherever it is. The operation today involved a variety of weapon systems, and it originated from a number of separate locations. We used land and sea-based aircraft, surface ships and submarines, and we employed a variety of weapons to achieve our objectives. As President Bush mentioned in his statement, dozens of countries contributed in specific ways to this mission, including transit and landing rights, basing opportunities, and intelligence support. In this mission, we are particularly grateful for the direct military involvement of the forces of Great Britain. To achieve the outcomes we seek, it is important to go after air defense and Taliban aircraft. We need the freedom to operate on the ground and in the air, and the targets selected, if successfully destroyed, should permit an increasing degree of freedom over time. We have also targeted command facilities for those forces that we know support terrorist elements within Afghanistan and critical terrorist sites. President Bush has repeatedly emphasized that we will hold accountable any who help terrorists as well as the terrorists themselves. Before I take your questions, let me say that to say that these attacks are in any way against Afghanistan or the Afghan people is flat wrong. We support the Afghan people against the Al-Qaeda, a foreign presence on their land, and against the Taliban regime that supports them. What took place today and what will be taking place in the period ahead is a part of the measured and broad and sustained effort that the President announced shortly after the attacks on September 11th. General Myers, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, will make a few remarks before we respond to questions.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I know you have many questions to ask, so I'll keep my comments brief. The Secretary said today our forces have begun the initial part of military operations in the war against terrorism. About 15 land-based bombers, some 25 strike aircraft from carriers, and U.S. and British ships and submarines launching approximately 50 Tomahawk missiles have struck terrorist targets in Afghanistan. The first target was hit at approximately 12:30 Eastern Standard Time, and operations continue as we speak. As the Secretary said, these efforts are designed to disrupt and destroy terrorist activities in Afghanistan and to set the conditions for future military action, as well as to bring much-needed food and medical aid to the people of Afghanistan. I want to remind you that while today's operations are visible, many other operations may not be so visible. But visible or not, our friends and enemies should understand that all instruments of our national power, as well as those of our friends and allies around the world, are being brought to bear on this global menace. We are in the early stages of ongoing combat operations, and our outstanding men and women in uniform are performing just as they've been trained to do, and that is to say, superbly. With that, ladies and gentlemen, we're ready to take your questions.
Mr. Secretary, might I ask, I know you don't want to give too many details, especially early on, you said 15 land-based bombers, approximately 50. Could you tell us whether B-1s, B-52s, and B-2s were used in this?
They were.
B-2s were used. And did you hit, we're told you hit a broad range of targets. Did you hit air bases? Did you attack Taliban jets and air bases?
Well, as I indicated in my remarks, it is certainly necessary if one is going to engage in humanitarian activities that involve the air or the ground that one would not want to try to do that as long as the Taliban had aircraft or air defense systems that could pose a threat to U.S. personnel.
Just one brief follow-up. Did the B-2s, were they flying round trip from the United States as they did on the Kosovo operation?
Yes, they flew from the continental United States.
Tell us how extensive the humanitarian effort has been thus far, and how many C-17s worth of various types of refugee food and blankets and medicine are you dropping? Is there some way to quantify it?
It started 20 or 30 minutes ago and is just in its beginning stages.
Can you give us some description of how many tons of food and medicine you're trying to deliver?
Well, we could. As I say, it's in the beginning stages, and this is a first day. The first day was something like 37,000 rations, as I recall, 37,500. But whether or not that will all get delivered is something we won't know for a few hours.
It includes more than just food, is that correct?
It does include some medicines and that type of thing.
General Myers, can you give us a sense of the weapons being dropped by the bombers? The Secretary said this is not an attack against the Afghan people. That would be flat wrong to say. That presupposes we're using precision-guided weapons to avoid casualties. All three of those bombers you mentioned can drop these JDAM satellite bombs. Is that the sort of ordnance being dropped today?
We are using, or essentially have at hand, all our conventional munitions, but you're right, Tony, that the majority of them are precision weapons, but not exclusively, because some targets, we try to match targets and weapons and their effects.
Mr. Secretary, you said, and General Myers said, that the raids have been ongoing now for about 2.5 hours, but using 50 TLAMs. One would assume that there is an end to this initial phase. Can you tell us if this initial phase is going to go on much longer, or is it for all intents and purposes over as of this point?
It is not yet over.
Secretary, was Osama bin Laden targeted in this raid, and can you give us, understanding that it's still early, any preliminary assessment of how successful these attacks have been?
No, it's far too early to try to measure success, and the answer is no with respect to him. This is not about a single individual. It's about an entire terrorist network and multiple terrorist networks across the globe. We would not have actual reports on the success of the various attacks for some time.
Mr. Secretary, are the airdrops that have, you say, just begun, will that be a continuous operation, or is this a one-time effort?
Well, the President's approach to this is that it will be continuous, but that it will be broadly based, and it will be economic and political and diplomatic, as well as military, overt and covert. And the fact that one sees a cruise missile on television at one moment and does not at another moment ought not to suggest that the pressure and the President's approach to this is anything but continuous. It is continuous.
The humanitarian part, I was referring to the airdrops. Is that to be continuous?
I don't know quite what continuous means. 24-hour days, 7 days a week? No, unlikely. On the other hand, once there is an opportunity to begin the humanitarian effort on the ground, I suppose it could be characterized as continuous.
Mr. Secretary, can you give us any idea whether or not this is, I know it's still ongoing, but is this essentially a one-day operation in this phase, or should we expect that there'll be more activity tomorrow? And the second part, will the United States impose essentially a no-fly zone over Afghanistan as it did over Bosnia and Iraq in the past?
I think that rather than trying to characterize what the United States is going to do on any given day, in advance that I would prefer to say that this effort will continue in a variety of different ways over a sustained period of time, and that we intend to pursue it until such time as we're satisfied that those terrorist networks don't exist, that they have been destroyed.
No-fly zone?
I don't know that I'd want to characterize it as that, although certainly one would think that if one of your early objectives is to deal with their aircraft and their air defense system,
Mr. Secretary,
it very likely would reduce the number of Taliban aircraft flying around over Afghanistan, I would hope, yes.
Have you seen any response so far from the Taliban military? Have they flown? Have they launched anything?
Too early. Too early to know.
Mr. Secretary, the Taliban has basically boasted that Osama bin Laden is still alive, as well as Mullah Mohammed Omar. What would you say to them about that sort of a boast?
Well, the Taliban, since the beginning of this, have been rejected every suggestion, request, or demand made by the United States of America and the coalition partners. They have established themselves as being firmly connected to Al-Qaeda and the foreign presence in their country. They've made a choice. And I don't know that there's anything to say beyond that they are what they are. And they're bringing great harm to the Afghan people.
You expect the United Alliance to... Can you say anything about the Northern Alliance? Was this coordinated with them? And are they picking up any ground as a result of this? Or are they linking up with U.S. forces? Can you give us any sense of what's going on the ground?
Sure. There are a number of elements on the ground in Afghanistan, Afghan people, in the Northern Alliance, in the tribes in the south, even some within Taliban that do not favor Omar and do not favor the Al-Qaeda and would wish they were no longer in their country. Certainly our interest is to strengthen those forces that are opposed to Al-Qaeda and opposed to the Taliban leadership that is so intimately connected to them, and to strengthen all of those forces so that they will have better opportunities to prevail and to deal with what obviously is a regime that is enormously harmful to the Afghan people and poses threats to people all across this globe, including the United States of America.
And do you plan to put ground troops in Afghanistan? Do you plan to put ground troops in Afghanistan?
It's been said many times from the podium that there just aren't that many targets in Afghanistan. Apparently you found some. Can you explain that? And also, can you address what seems to be somewhat of an anomaly in this mission, the idea that you're fighting your way in order to drop humanitarian relief on people? And if the places where you're dropping relief, if you're getting shot at there, are you not essentially dropping relief on the enemy?
Well, first, with respect to the targets, I think I've said repeatedly from this podium that there are not a lot of high-value targets. I've pointed out that the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda do not have armies, navies, and air forces. And that's clear. They don't. I've therefore characterized this conflict, this campaign, this so-called war, as being notably different from others. And it means that what we have to do is exactly what I said in my earlier remarks. We have to create the conditions for a sustained effort that will assist those forces in the country that are opposed to Taliban and opposed to Al-Qaeda. And we have to do it in a variety of different ways. We have to dry up their bank accounts. We have to bring political, diplomatic pressure to bear on them. We have to bring economic pressure to bear. And to the extent we can, use overt as well as covert activities to improve target information, to gather intelligence that will enable us to be more precise in what we do, and to force people to move and change what they're doing, to raise the cost of what they're doing, to attempt to reduce the number of people around the globe who support them and finance them. All of that helps. The fact is, in this battle against terrorism, there is no silver bullet. There is no single thing that is going to suddenly make that threat disappear. Ultimately, they're going to collapse from within, and they're going to collapse from within because of the full combination of all of the resources from all of the countries that are brought to bear on these networks. And that is what will constitute victory.
General Myers, have
Ground troops,
casualties or losses?
Will you be providing arms and air cover to the opposition forces to strengthen them? And,
as I say, I don't think our goal is to make them more successful. Getting into exactly how we'll do that, I think I'll defer.
Do you plan to send U.S. ground troops into Afghanistan?
Secretary, you said a moment ago, you spoke of multiple terrorist networks in multiple countries. Is this phase of the operation going to involve strikes in some other places other than Afghanistan?
As you know, we've had a policy here, at least during my tenure, where we don't discuss ongoing operations and we don't discuss intelligence matters.
Do you plan to put U.S. ground troops into Yugoslavia?
Go ahead.
Would you please describe the Taliban anti-aircraft systems you're going to be deploying? Is it AAA surface-to-air missiles? And have any of the American aircraft been damaged or brought down?
We have no information that any American aircraft has been damaged or brought down at this moment, at least prior to the time I walked in here. There is, as I believe Dick Myers has pointed out, they do have a limited number of surface-to-air missiles, and they have more than a limited number of man-operated, man-mobile surface-to-air missiles.
Mr. Secretary, could you give us a sense of how many targets you've hit? More than a dozen?
We have no way to discuss the outcome of this operation.